July 17th, 1966. Hendersonville, North Carolina. 43-year-old Vernon Shipman and 36-year-old Charles Glass both go missing, and Vernon's abandoned car is soon found on a dirt road. 5 days later, Vernon and Charles's bodies are discovered in an isolated area alongside the body of a 61-year-old Asheville resident named Louise Davis Shumate, and all three victims have been bludgeoned to death. Even though Louise has no known connection to Vernon or Charles, multiple witnesses report having seen all three of them inside Vernon's car with an unidentified man prior to their deaths. Decades later, investigators expressed their belief that a deceased criminal named Edward Thompson committed the murders, but there is no conclusive evidence to implicate him, and the crime is never solved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering one of the most bizarre triple homicides I've ever come across. The 1966 murders of Vernon Shipman, Charles Glass, and Louise Davis Shumate. I'm actually going to be paying a visit to the Asheville area this coming weekend, and wanted to pick a case from the area to cover, and wound up uncovering one of the deepest rabbit holes I've gone down in quite some time. This is the story of three victims who were found bludgeoned to death in an isolated area just outside Henderson, North Carolina. Vernon and Charles were close friends who lived in Hendersonville, and since both men were gay, and this was a time and a place when that was not socially accepted, one of the many theories surrounding this murder was that it might have been a hate crime. However, the thing which left everyone scratching their heads was the presence of Louise Davis Shumate's body. Louise lived in the city of Asheville, 25 miles away, and as far as anyone could tell, she did not know Vernon or Charles. What made things even more confusing was that Vernon and Louise's abandoned cars were each found at separate locations miles away from the murder scene, and there were multiple witnesses who reported seeing the three victims inside Vernon's car with an unidentified man. While it seemed likely that this guy was the killer, there are a ton of unanswered questions about how these events unfolded, and why Vernon, Charles, and Louise all wound up being murdered together. Over the years, there would be a number of potential suspects in this case, and some investigators expressed their belief that the perpetrator was a career criminal named Edward Thompson. While Thompson certainly fits the profile of someone who would be capable of a triple homicide like this, there are still some holes in that theory, and even if Thompson did do it, that still doesn't explain why or how these three victims wound up being killed simultaneously. I've used a number of different sources for this episode, but a special shout out should go out to reporter Jenny Jones-Giles, who published an extensive series of articles about this case for the Hendersonville Times-News titled Small Town Big Crime. This was done in order to commemorate the crime's 40th anniversary in 2006, and they proved to be a valuable source of information. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can gather access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page has around 70 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available in our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murders of Vernon Shipman, Charles Glass, and Louise Davis Shumate. Our story begins in 1966 in Hendersonville, North Carolina, which is located in Henderson County about 25 miles south of Asheville and had a population of around 6,000 at that time. One of our central figures is 43-year-old Vernon Shipman, who has lived in Hendersonville his entire life. Vernon is employed by the North Carolina Employment Security Commission and known for being a kind, soft-spoken gentleman who is willing to help anyone and loved to host dinner parties. While Vernon's mother, Vesta Shipman, passed away in 1954, he currently lives with his 74-year-old father, Harley Shipman, at their family home on Maple Street. Vernon also owns a popular local establishment called the Tempo Music Shop, which is known for selling rock and roll and rhythm and blues records and is managed by our second central figure, 36-year-old Charles Glass. Charles was originally born in Asheville before he moved to Hendersonville in 1952, and he is known for being a very friendly and outgoing music lover who throws large parties at his home. Vernon and Charles also happen to be gay, but even though they are longtime friends, they are not actually involved in a relationship with each other and are both currently single. Given that Hendersonville was known for being a conservative Bible Belt community during that time period, Vernon was very secretive about his sexual orientation, though Charles was a lot more open about it, and it's been reported that most people from the area already knew that both men were gay. On the afternoon of Sunday, July the 17th, Vernon and his father Harley had a late breakfast together at their residence before Harley left at around 2 p.m. But when Harley returned home at 8:30 that evening, he was surprised to discover that his son was not there, and Vernon's car, a blue 1962 Ford Fairlane with a white roof, was also missing. Oddly, the front door was left open, and Vernon's coat and tie were lying on Harley's bed, even though Vernon never left clothing in his father's room. Vernon did not come home that night and failed to show up for work the following morning, which was very uncharacteristic of him. Charles was scheduled to open up the Tempo Music Shop that morning, but he also did not show up and could not be found at his own residence on Wildwood Road. Charles's disappearance was all the more unusual because he had broken his left leg several months earlier and was still wearing a boot on his left foot and using crutches to get around. Attempts were made to file missing persons reports for both men with the Hendersonville Police Department, but they initially did not take their disappearances all that seriously. Since it was no big secret that Vernon and Charles were gay, the police apparently believed that they had just run off to go partying somewhere, so no report was officially filed until Wednesday, July the 20th. Well, it turned out that very same day, Vernon's abandoned Ford Fairlane was discovered only 3 blocks from his home, resting on a dirt road that ran parallel to the railroad tracks between Ray Avenue and 7th Avenue East. The keys were still in the ignition, and some cigarette butts, one of which had lipstick on it, were found in the right rear ashtray. A base and handle of a bumper jack was found inside the vehicle, though the shaft was missing. It turned out that eyewitnesses had recalled seeing the Fairlane parked at the location as early as 7 a.m. on Monday, July the 18th, the morning after both men went missing. It was established that Vernon and Charles had been together on the afternoon of July the 17th, as numerous witnesses recalled seeing them at a local restaurant and antique shop. That evening, Vernon was scheduled to have dinner with a friend of his named Robert Amston. Robert claimed that he called Vernon's residence at 4:45 p.m., and when Charles answered the phone, Robert left a message asking Vernon to pick him up at the Echo Inn restaurant and lodge in the nearby town of Laurel Park, which is where Robert worked as an assistant manager. He wanted Vernon to pick him up at 5:30 p.m. so they could go to the Hendersonville Country Club for dinner, but even though Charles said he would pass along the message, Vernon never showed up to meet Robert. When Robert called Vernon's residence to see where he was, he said that no one answered the phone, and he never saw or heard from Vernon that night. Well, at around 5:30, when Vernon should have been picking up Robert, another friend of Vernon's named Sue Nichols called his residence. Sue claimed that Charles answered and sounded drunk, and she could hear the sound of someone in the background telling Charles to get off the phone several times. Sue believed this was Vernon's voice, and she soon heard footsteps, followed by Charles saying, quote, "No, Vernon, God, no, don't hit me," before the line suddenly went dead. It turned out that shortly after this call took place, 3 eyewitnesses recalled having seen Vernon driving his Fairlane through the area with Charles in the passenger seat. But what made the situation unusual is that each witness also saw an unidentified man and woman in the back seat. The woman appeared to be in her 50s or early 60s, and the man was described as being a white male between the age of 40 and 50 who had a thin build and wore wraparound sunglasses and a dark blue suit with pinstripes. The first sighting took place at around 5:45 p.m. from a woman who said she saw the Fairlane heading north on North Carolina Highway 191, and the next two sightings were from eyewitnesses who both knew Vernon and Charles personally. At 6 p.m., the Fairlane was seen on Evans Road by Ronnie Holifield, the circulation manager of the Hendersonville Times-News, and he said that it appeared to be heading in the direction of Crab Creek Road. Since Evans Road was very narrow, two cars could not travel on it at once, so Holifield pulled over and waved at them to pass by. When they did, Vernon and Charles did not even acknowledge Holifield, though the unknown woman looked over in his direction and smiled at him. The second witness was Calvert Hunt Jr., a part-time employee at the Tempo Music Shop, who said that he passed by the Fairlane on Little River Road at 6:30 and it appeared to be heading towards U.S. Route 25 south. Well, Vernon and Charles continued to remain missing for the next 5 days, but during the late afternoon of Friday, July the 22nd, a pair of workers were clearing brush on a dirt trail in an isolated grassy area located near Lake Summit off North Lake Summit Road when they came across the two men's decomposing bodies. They had both been bludgeoned with a blunt instrument, crushing their skulls. An 18-inch piece of scrap iron, which may have been the murder weapon, was placed across Vernon's neck, and Charles's crutches were lying over his torso in the shape of a cross. Due to the level of decomposition, both victims were virtually unrecognizable, but they were identified when their wallets were found at the scene, though the money had been removed from both of them. The location was about 8 miles south of Hendersonville and 6 miles away from the spot where Vernon's abandoned Fairlane had been found, and it was estimated that the victims had been dead since July the 17th, the same day they went missing. However, the decomposed body of a woman was also found at the scene, and it appeared that all three victims had been arranged in a crude semicircle. Like Vernon and Charles, the woman had been bludgeoned with a blunt instrument, and her left wrist and elbow were broken, which was possibly caused when she attempted to use her arm to block one of the blows. It also turned out that Charles had 18 puncture wounds on the left side of his neck and 3 on the surface of his chest, while the woman had a total of 17 puncture wounds on her breasts and abdomen. There was also an empty whiskey bottle resting on a scarf on top of her neck. The woman's bra had been removed and was found nearby, and her pants were pulled down. Even more disturbingly, she had been sexually assaulted with the missing shaft from the bumper jack in Vernon's car, as it was inside her vagina. It was theorized that this was the same woman whom witnesses saw inside the Fairlane with Vernon and Charles, and a pair of prescription sunglasses and a change purse were found at the scene. The purse contained 16 cents and the woman's driver's license, which identified her as Louise Davis Shumate. While the license listed Louise's birth year as 1911, it turned out that she was actually born on August 21st, 1904, meaning that she was only 1 month shy of her 62nd birthday at the time of her death. Originally born in Asheville under the name Opal Louise Davis, Louise got married to a man named Azel Francis Shumate in 1933, but even though they later divorced, she continued to use both her maiden and married surnames. After moving around a lot and living in a number of different states, Louise eventually returned to Asheville and got a job at Taylor Instruments Companies in the unincorporated community of Arden. Louise was known for being a very private and reclusive person, and some of her co-workers described her as being difficult to get along with and having racist views, as she openly expressed her dislike for integration, which had only recently began in the area. Well, needless to say, the presence of Louise's body at the murder scene completely perplexed investigators because as far as anyone could tell, she did not know Vernon or Charles and had no personal connection to them. Last time Louise was confirmed to be alive was when she was seen leaving her apartment at around 4:30 p.m. on Sunday, July the 17th, and in an odd coincidence, her car happened to be a blue 1962 Ford Fairlane, the same brand of vehicle that Vernon drove. While Louise was never officially reported missing, it turned out that her Fairlane had been found abandoned in a remote area on Tuesday, July the 19th. The vehicle was discovered at the end of an old paved road just off Highway 191 near the French Broad River and the spot was about halfway between Asheville and Hendersonville and 14 miles away from the murder scene. The keys were still in the ignition, the windows were rolled down, and the doors were unlocked. Louise's handbag was also hanging on the door handle, though its change purse had been removed and was found near her body. The triple homicide was undoubtedly the most puzzling and sensational crime the area had ever seen up until that point, so an extensive investigation would be launched, which involved the Hendersonville Police Department, the Henderson County Sheriff's Office, and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. However, the person who pretty much took control of the investigation was Buncombe County Sheriff Harry Clay. Even though the crime technically occurred in Henderson County, Louise lived in Asheville, which was a part of Buncombe County, so Clay seemed to have a vested interest in solving the crime. Given the circumstances, it seemed likely that the unidentified man with the sunglasses who had been in the back seat of Vernon's Fairlane was the killer, so he became the prime suspect, and a composite sketch was created and circulated for him. As you might recall, Sue Nichols had made a phone call to the Shipman residence at 5:30 p.m. on July the 17th, and her account seemed to suggest that Vernon and Charles may have been under duress at that time and were forced to drive away in the Fairlane by their killer shortly after the call ended. However, what no one could figure out is how Louise wound up in the car alongside them before they were murdered. According to those who knew her, Louise sometimes liked to drive into Henderson County to pick blackberries from some bushes located near Highway 191. One possible theory is that the unidentified man may have forced Vernon and Charles to drive into this area with the intention of killing them there, but wound up coming across Louise and her parked Fairlane. Since he feared she might be a potential witness, the man then decided to abduct Louise and placed her in the back seat of Vernon's Fairlane. He then ordered Vernon to drive them to another remote location on North Lake Summit Road, where he proceeded to murder all three of the victims. Some of the earliest newspaper coverage seemed to support this theory, as it was reported that a jar containing blackberries had been found in Louise's abandoned car, and blackberries were scattered throughout the area. But the lead agent from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation later debunked this information and said it was inaccurate, clarifying that no blackberries were found at the scene at all, and there was no evidence to indicate that Louise had driven to this location in order to pick them. There also happened to be an odd discrepancy on the odometer of Vernon's Fairlane. On July the 15th, 2 days before he went missing, Vernon had gotten an oil change on his car and the mileage was recorded. But when this mileage was compared to the odometer, it was calculated that it had been driven 259 miles before it was abandoned. For nearly a year, investigators had a difficult time trying to account for all these miles, but there turned out to be a ridiculous explanation for this. In May of 1967, the Henderson County Sheriff's Office announced that a young man named Dennis Waters had signed a statement in which he confessed to having moved Vernon's car shortly after he went missing. Waters claimed that he and three of his friends came across the abandoned Fairlane on a dirt road at around 8:15 p.m. on the evening of July the 17th. Since the keys were in the ignition, Waters and his friends decided to take the car for a joyride. About an hour later, they returned the car to the same spot where they originally found it, and this accounted for the additional miles on the odometer. But while this provided some unnecessary complications for the investigation, the authorities ruled out Waters and his friends as having any involvement in the murders. Even though investigators could not find any conclusive evidence that Louise knew Vernon and Charles, there were a few hints to suggest that they might have been acquainted. I mentioned earlier that Louise and Vernon both happened to drive 1962 Ford Fairlanes, and when Louise originally purchased her car, she apparently told one of her relatives that she had a quote-unquote very good friend who had a car just like it. When Charles was recovering from his broken leg at the hospital several months before his death, a woman reportedly came to visit him, and one hospital employee identified her as Louise from a photograph. There was also one witness who recalled seeing Louise at a party being held by Vernon and Charles at the George Vanderbilt Hotel in Asheville in the summer of 1965, and during the spring of 1966, another witness said that he saw Charles's two aunts drinking wine with another woman in the back of the Tempo Music Shop, and Charles introduced her as his quote-unquote foster aunt, Louise of Asheville. This witness later identified Louise as the foster aunt from a photograph. As you can imagine, there were a lot of sensational rumors surrounding the crime, one of which was that it might have been connected to drugs. This rumor was amplified by the fact that following Louise's death, $12,000 was found in a savings account belonging to her, and no one from her family knew where it came from. It was reported that virtually every Thursday, when she showed up for her shift at Taylor Instrument Companies, Louise would bring a brown package to work with her and leave it with security at the guard station. When her shift ended, Louise would collect the package and supposedly drive to Hendersonville rather than back home to Asheville. This led to speculation that Louise, Vernon, and Charles might have been involved in the drug trade together, and this paved the way for their murders, but none of this information was ever substantiated, and it may have been nothing more than gossip. Of course, given Vernon and Charles' sexual orientation, there was a lot of theorizing that the murders were a hate crime. Not surprisingly, this led to even more unsubstantiated gossip about the two men, such as them trading drugs for sexual favors at nightclubs, or blackmailing people with compromising photographs of Charles sleeping with wealthy, prominent men and holding wild parties attended by underage boys. But it must be reiterated that none of these rumors were ever proven true, and may have been the result of the rampant homophobia which pervaded the area during that time period. This also likely had a negative effect on the investigation, as it was believed that members of the area's gay community were reluctant to talk to police for fear of outing themselves. There were even rumors that the Ku Klux Klan may have been responsible for the crime. Like I mentioned earlier, integration had only recently begun in Henderson County, and the Temple Music Shop was a popular spot for the area's black residents because Vernon and Charles treated them well, so they considered the shop to be a safe haven. Charles had been a blues singer who occasionally went on tour with a popular rhythm and blues singer named Esther Phillips, who performed under the name Little Esther. At one point, Charles invited Little Esther to visit him in Hendersonville and stay at his residence, but this prompted some unidentified individuals to leave a burning cross in Charles's yard. 12 days after the murders, another burning cross was found in the middle of the road about a quarter-mile away from the spot where the bodies were discovered. In spite of this, the authorities made it clear that they could find no evidence that the KKK were involved in the crime. One of the most outrageous theories was that the murders were somehow related to voodoo. Charles had a devout interest in the subject, as he was known for selling voodoo charms and elixirs, and even published and sold a booklet titled Tales of Voodoo and Black Magic under the pseudonym Charles Levere, which is the French word for glass. Since the three victims' bodies had been arranged in a semicircle, and Charles's crutches were draped over his torso in the shape of a cross, this caused rumors to circulate that the crime was some sort of voodoo sacrifice, but once again, there was nothing to substantiate this. Over the years, there would be a number of potential suspects, and while I'll talk about some of them later on, here are two which stood out during the early stages of the investigation. As you might recall, one of the witnesses who saw the three victims in Vernon's Ford Fairlane with an unidentified man was Calvert Hunt Jr., a part-time employee from the Temple Music Shop. Well, Calvert was convinced that the man in the back seat was 25-year-old Frank Myers, who was a close friend of Vernon's. In fact, Frank just happened to be the half-brother of Sue Nichols, who had called Vernon's residence and spoke to Charles on the phone right before the two men went missing. According to Calvert, right after they disappeared, he brought the Hendersonville police chief Bill Powers into the Temple Music Shop so they could search the file cabinets, and they discovered a folder containing a number of IOUs which showed that Frank owed Vernon about $1,000. However, after the two men's bodies were discovered, Calvert said that he and Chief Powers checked the file cabinet again, but the folder containing the IOUs had gone missing. The reason Frank owed money to Vernon is because he had helped pay for plastic surgery Frank received following a car accident. I have no idea if there's any truth to this at all, but the prevalent rumor is that Charles was jealous of Frank's friendship with Vernon and created a voodoo doll for him. And shortly after Charles disfigured the doll's face, Frank got into his accident, which required surgery on his face. This whole situation created a potential motive for the murders, but Frank's mother provided him with an alibi, insisting that Frank was with their family at Lake Norman about 100 miles away on the night of the murders. In 1969, Frank was fatally shot by his aunt's husband during a domestic dispute. Investigators were inclined to believe that Frank was not the perpetrator, as even though Calvert had identified him as the man in the Fairlane, the other eyewitnesses who saw the man did not. They also described him as being in his 40s, whereas Frank was 25. In spite of this, when Calvert was interviewed about the case decades later, he continued to insist that the man he saw was Frank. Another intriguing suspect was a 40-year-old chiropractor named Paul Saxman, who had grown up next door to the Shipman family and was close friends with Vernon. Paul eventually moved to Indianapolis with his third wife and elderly father, but was renting out his family's home in Hendersonville and had made an arrangement with Vernon to collect the rent money and make the mortgage payments at the local bank. However, during the fall of 1965, Paul discovered that his house was receiving foreclosure warnings from the bank as the rental payments were not being made to them. When Paul traveled back to Hendersonville, he accused Charles of pocketing the rent money which was collected, and the two men got into a heated argument at the Tempo music shop. Paul's marriage was falling apart at this point, and in May of 1966, shortly after his wife told him she wanted a divorce, he attempted suicide by a self-inflicted gunshot wound, though he wound up surviving. After Paul's house went into foreclosure, a Hendersonville woman purchased it and a new tenant moved in, but in February of 1967, they found a frog gigging pole in the closet which appeared to have blood on it and turned it over to the authorities. A frog gigging pole is a spear ordinarily used to impale frogs in the water and pull them out, but even though the State Bureau of Investigation lab in Raleigh performed some testing, they were unable to determine if the blood on it belonged to a human or an amphibian. Regardless, the whole situation prompted investigators to look at Paul as a potential suspect. A search of records at Paul's chiropractic clinic in Indianapolis revealed that he saw no patients between July the 14th and July the 18th, 1966, which was the time period when the murders took place. When questioned, Paul could not account for his whereabouts or provide an alibi for these dates, though it was believed that he may have traveled to Hendersonville at some point in order to arrange the sale of his family's house. Paul did make arrangements with investigators to take a polygraph test, but when the date arrived, his lawyer showed up instead and said that his client would not be taking the test after all. Paul never returned to Hendersonville and spent the rest of his life living in Indianapolis before he died in a nursing home in November of 2006 at the age of 80. Well, in March of 1968, it appeared that the case might finally be solved when a 33-year-old suspect named Joe Henry Parham was implicated in the crime. Parham was a migrant worker with a third-grade education who originally hailed from South Carolina, but he wound up getting arrested in Fort Myers, Florida for possession of burglary tools. While being held in the Lee County Jail, Parham supposedly made some statements about having killed Charles Glass. The Henderson County Sheriff at this point was James Kilpatrick, who traveled to Florida to interview Parham and got him to sign a confession. Parham was subsequently extradited to Henderson County and charged with Charles's murder, though he was not officially charged with the murders of Vernon or Louise. Sheriff Kilpatrick expressed his belief that Parham was guilty, since he allegedly revealed a lot of details about the crime which were not public knowledge. But surprisingly, Buncombe County Sheriff Harry Clay disagreed and told the press that he suspected Parham's confession was false and did not believe he was the killer. While he was incarcerated in the Henderson County Jail, Parham attempted suicide by slashing his wrists, but he wound up surviving and was transferred to a psychiatric unit. On May the 28th, 2 months after Parham was arrested, Hendersonville Justice of the Peace James Gilliam dismissed the murder charge after failing to find probable cause or sufficient evidence against him. Gilliam believed that Parham falsely confessed to the murders to get extradited to North Carolina, and Sheriff Kilpatrick told the press that he agreed with the decision to release Parham, stating, quote, "We have made every effort to positively prove Mr. Parham's guilt as well as his innocence, if he is. Because of his arrest, we have learned a great deal of valuable information and feel that in the very near future, the case will be solved and a conviction obtained on the guilty parties." End quote. 8 months later, Parham was arrested on a breaking and entering charge in Buncombe County, and Sheriff Clay told the press that while he was in custody on that charge, Parham finally admitted that the confession was a hoax, and that he had learned about the murders from reading an article in True Detective magazine. In recent years, there has been some debate about whether Parham was dismissed as a suspect too easily, but I'll be talking more about that later on in this episode. Anyway, the investigation into the crime would eventually reach a standstill, and Vernon's father, Harley Shipman, passed away in October of 1986 at the age of 94 without receiving any answers about what happened to his son. In July of 2006, the case returned to the spotlight when reporter Jenny Jones-Giles published an extensive series of articles for the Hendersonville Times-News titled Small Town, Big Crime in order to commemorate the 40-year anniversary. This seemed to garner the attention of the court TV series Haunting Evidence, who decided to produce an episode about this case, which aired in August of 2007. In case you're not familiar with the show, each episode of Haunting Evidence featured a psychic profiler, spirit medium, and a paranormal investigator traveling to a location where an unsolved cold case took place. The trio would supposedly have no prior knowledge of the crime, and there were hopes that they might experience visions or receive communication from the victims in order to help provide new leads. The medium on this particular episode, John J. Oliver, claimed that he had a vision of a particular suspect whom he described as being an African-American male with a long and broad nose, a slight mustache, full lips, and a slight part in his hair. Well, it turned out that a career criminal named Edward Thompson Jr. matched this description and had been one of the strongest suspects in the investigation. In fact, shortly after the Haunting Evidence episode aired, a new article was published about the case in the Hendersonville Times-News, which explored Thompson's background and contained this quote from now-retired Hendersonville Police Chief Bill Powers, quote, "Case closed, Edward Thompson did it," end quote. Indeed, two other former investigators who had worked the case had concurred with this conclusion in prior interviews, as they also believed Thompson was the perpetrator. In May of 1968, Thompson was 36 years old and would embark on a massive crime spree throughout North Carolina and Virginia in which he kidnapped 11 people, raped 5, and killed 2. In fact, Thompson became the last person in the history of North Carolina to officially be declared an outlaw, as one article published in the Times-News contained this passage, quote, "Any citizen who sees him may arrest him on sight or kill him if he resists, without being subject to legal action," end quote. Thompson's crime spree began in Hendersonville on May the 9th, when he kidnapped a doctor and his wife from their home at gunpoint. He proceeded to drive the couple to another location and inject them with drugs from the doctor's medical kit before he drove off with their car. The spree continued on for the next 2 months until Thompson kidnapped 3 teenage girls and 2 adults on July the 15th and took them all into an abandoned house in Roanoke, Virginia. The car belonged to 50-year-old J. Howard Davis, who was the father of one of the girls, and the second adult was 50-year-old Hester Freeman, the mother and aunt of the other 2 girls. After fatally shooting the 2 adults, Thompson took the girls and drove back to North Carolina in Davis's car. Law enforcement finally captured Thompson and rescued the girls outside Greensboro on July the 17th, which, appropriately enough, just happened to be the 2-year anniversary of the Henderson County murders. Thompson wound up pleading guilty to 7 different charges stemming from his crimes in North Carolina, so he received 5 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. He was never officially convicted for the murders of J. Howard Davis and Hester Freeman, since that would have required extraditing him to Virginia to stand trial. Investigators did briefly interview Thompson in prison in 1969, but he denied any involvement in the Hendersonville murders, and no conclusive evidence could be found to implicate him. On July the 16th, 1989, Thompson died of AIDS at the Central Prison in Raleigh at the age of 58. The aforementioned articles in the Hendersonville Times-News pointed out at least 20 similarities between Thompson's crime spree and the 1966 triple homicide, which made investigators believe he was a compelling suspect. For instance, like the mystery man in the Fairlane, Thompson often liked to wear dark sunglasses. When Thompson kidnapped his victims in 1968, he would often force them to drive around for a while in their own car. After leaving his victims in a remote location, he would then steal their car and subsequently abandon it elsewhere and leave the keys in the ignition. 2 of the people whom Thompson kidnapped also told police that he said to them, quote, "I have a gun, I've already killed 3 people, 2 more won't make a difference, end quote. And some of Thompson's crimes took place within a few miles of where Vernon, Charles, and Louise's bodies were discovered. While Thompson's whereabouts on the date of the triple homicide are unknown, it was established that he was in Henderson County just over 2 weeks later when he was arrested and charged with 2 counts of assault for threatening a woman on August the 4th. When Thompson became a wanted fugitive in 1968, police performed a search of his residence and found that he had a lot of newspaper articles about the triple homicide. Now obviously, the biggest hole in the theory of Thompson being the perpetrator is that the eyewitnesses who reported seeing an unidentified man in the fair lane with Vernon, Charles, and Louise described him as being white. However, investigators have accounted for this by saying that since Thompson was lighter-skinned, the witnesses could have mistaken him for being white from a distance. Since Thompson was cremated following his death, I do not believe the authorities have his DNA on file, but it may not make much of a difference anyway, as virtually all the physical evidence from this case has gone missing. The story goes that the boxes of evidence were sent to the State Bureau of Investigation lab in Raleigh for analysis before they were returned to the Henderson County Sheriff's Office in July of 1969. But shortly thereafter, the boxes vanished without a trace. The most prominent theory is that they were placed inside the evidence room of the Henderson County Courthouse, which was undergoing renovations at that time, and that the boxes may have been removed during a cleanup and mistakenly disposed of at a landfill. The only known piece of evidence which could be found decades later were Charles's crutches, which had been placed over his torso at the murder scene, but it does not appear that it contained any forensic evidence, so solving this crime via DNA testing may not be an option. So after 6 decades, the murders of Vernon Shipman, Charles Glass, and Louise Davis Shumate are still unsolved, and the motive for this crime remains a big mystery. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So needless to say, it's definitely rare to find a homicide scene in which there are multiple victims present who don't seem to have any connection to each other. Whenever this happens, you often assume that one of the victims was the intended target, while the other victim was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps the most famous case like this are the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson, who was likely an example of the former, and Ronald Goldman, who was believed to be an example of the latter. In this particular case, the consensus from some investigators was that Vernon Shipman and/or Charles Glass were the intended target, while Louise Davis Shumate was a completely innocent bystander who somehow got mixed up in something she wasn't involved with and was murdered for it. However, as we're going to talk about, not everyone agrees with that assessment. What really complicates this case is that we have at least 3 potential crime scenes which were miles apart from each other. The spot where the 3 victims' bodies were discovered, the location where Vernon's car was abandoned, and the spot where Louise's abandoned car was found. There's also been speculation that the actual murder scene was an entirely different location and the victims' bodies were dumped near Lake Summit after the fact. And if this situation wasn't complicated enough, we also have multiple eyewitnesses who reported seeing Vernon, Charles, and Louise inside Vernon's car alongside an unidentified man who was likely their killer. When you look at all the evidence, it's incredibly difficult to come up with a logical scenario to explain how this crime unfolded and how everything went from point A to point Z. This case has a whole bunch of sensationalistic theories about how the murders were a homophobic hate crime or involved the Ku Klux Klan or were some sort of weird voodoo sacrifice, but it's possible that the truth may be a lot simpler. Since the victims' wallets were cleaned out, robbery may have been the motive, and perhaps these people were chosen completely at random. After all, certain investigators believe that the most likely perpetrator was Edward Thompson Jr., who went on a massive crime spree 2 years later in which there was seemingly no rhyme or reason to his actions. He definitely seems like the type of person who would randomly abduct separate victims from separate locations and then kill them together at the same spot. Some people have expressed their belief that this case is essentially solved, because even if Thompson did this, it might be impossible to conclusively prove it after all these years. However, One individual who has an issue with this narrative is an author named Terrence Ryerson Neal, who thinks that Thompson may have just been a convenient scapegoat. In February of 2020, Neal published a book titled The True Story of the 1966 Hendersonville Triple Murders, in which he performed an in-depth re-examination into this case. The whole project was intended to be a multi-volume series, and this book was subtitled Volume 1, The Confessions, 1966 to 1968. Neal said that he was planning to release Volume 2 sometime in late 2020, but here we are 4 years later, and we have yet to see any follow-ups. Since this project has not been completed, I don't know if Neal has his own fully fleshed out theory about what happened, but long story short, he is very skeptical that Edward Thompson actually committed this crime. And yes, while I do have to acknowledge that there are some compelling reasons to believe he might be the perpetrator, I have a really hard time getting past the fact that Thompson was black, yet all the witnesses who saw the man inside the fair lane with the 3 victims said he was white. I know the authorities have tried to account for this by theorizing that since Thompson was lighter skinned, the witnesses could have mistaken him for being white from a distance. Well, I've said time and time again on this podcast that eyewitnesses in cold cases can often be unreliable, but I'm not sure they would be this unreliable. I've seen a number of old photographs of Thompson from when he was arrested in 1968, and I have a really hard time believing that anyone could have mistook him for a white guy. Not to mention that the composite sketch, which was created and circulated for the man in the fair lane, looks nothing like Thompson. Hell, one of the witnesses, Calvert Hunt Jr., was absolutely certain that the mystery man was a guy he knew named Frank Myers. I can totally believe that Hunt could have confused Myers with another white man, but I seriously doubt he would have done the same with a black man. I suppose you could push forward the alternate theory that Thompson committed these murders with an accomplice who happened to be the white man seen in the car, but given that he went on a solo crime spree on his own just 2 years later, I find it very unlikely that he worked with anyone. I think what's particularly problematic about this whole situation is that at least 3 former investigators decided to publicly name Thompson as the killer right after the case was featured on an episode of Haunting Evidence in 2007. As you might recall, this episode featured a medium describing a vision he had of a black man whom he believed was the prime suspect, and they even produced a new composite sketch for this man, which was considerably different than the sketch that was produced for the white suspect back in 1966. And lo and behold, since the man in this new sketch had a resemblance to Edward Thompson, a new article was soon published where the crime was essentially pinned on him. Yeah, if I'm going to feel comfortable saying with absolute certainty that Thompson committed this crime, I'm afraid I'm going to need a lot more than an alleged psychic vision. It sounds like the whole Haunting Evidence episode was causing some serious confirmation bias to rise to the surface. Now, don't get me wrong, Thompson was still a horrible human being who committed a number of crimes, so it's not like publicly accusing him of the Hendersonville murders is needlessly smearing his reputation. But it's worth noting that while he did fatally shoot 2 people, J. Howard Davis and Hester Freeman, during his 1968 crime spree, Thompson did allow most of the victims he kidnapped and raped to live. If he had no qualms about bludgeoning 3 people to death back in 1966, then why wouldn't he have done it more often? Since Thompson died 35 years ago, no one can really prove or disprove his involvement in these murders, as investigators never found a smoking gun to tie him to the crime. Of course, in recent years, we've seen numerous examples of cold cases being solved when DNA testing and genetic genealogy posthumously links a crime to a suspect, even if they're already deceased. But unfortunately, since nearly all the physical evidence in this case was lost or destroyed a long time ago, that's just not an option here. Given that Edward Thompson was a black man in the southern United States during the 1960s, it's not hard to imagine him being a scapegoat, and while I would ordinarily believe he is a compelling suspect here, the eyewitness accounts of the white man in the fair lane is too much of a discrepancy to ignore. But even if Thompson was the perpetrator, that still doesn't explain the circumstances for why Vernon, Charles, and Louise were murdered together. I previously mentioned that Louise was known for having racist views and being against integration, whereas the 2 men were known for running a business which was very welcoming towards black people, and Charles had even performed with a popular black singer. Louise was also known for being very reclusive, while Vernon and Charles were both social butterflies, so they don't strike me as the type of people who would be friends with someone like her. Of course, there were a lot of wild, sensationalistic theories surrounding this case, and I don't put any stock into some of them, such as the angles involving voodoo or the Ku Klux Klan. I'm also not sure if Vernon and Charles' sexual orientation played a role in the crime either, but of course, given that this was the South during the 1960s, there were a lot of rumors and gossip which painted these two men as sexual deviants and perverts, and it would not surprise me if there were homophobic members of the community at that time who believed that the two victims had done something which paved the way for their murders. However, when Terrence Ryerson Neal performed research for this case, he discovered that most of these rumors were completely unfounded and that Vernon and Charles were just ordinary men trying to lead ordinary lives. He stated, quote, "I was happy to discover that the two male victims, Charles Glass and Vernon Shipman, were well liked and enjoyed life, despite the perverted twists that others tried to put on their lives. Sure, they had idiosyncrasies, but they didn't seem the least bit fazed by the straight-laced expectations of the community." End quote. As an aside, during the 1950s, the duo recorded a couple of records where Charles provided the vocals while Vernon played the piano, and some of their songs, under the titles Screamin' and Dyin' and Rollin' on the Floor and Left My Japanese Baby, can be found if you search on YouTube. And incidentally, if you listen to the lyrics for Screamin' and Dyin' and Rollin' on the Floor, it's quite a disturbing song, because it's pretty much about a guy singing about how he killed his woman because he caught her in bed with another man. Quite ironic to find a future murder victim singing a song about murdering someone. So let's look at how the known series of events played out prior to the murders. We really don't have all that much information about Louise's movements on July the 17th, only that she was seen leaving her apartment at 4:30 p.m., and her abandoned car somehow wound up in a remote area near the French Broad River, about halfway between Asheville and Hendersonville. As for Vernon, we know he was planning to go out to dinner that night with his friend Robert Amston, and when Robert phoned Vernon's residence at around 4:45, Charles answered, so Robert asked Charles to pass along a message for Vernon to pick him up at the Echo Inn at 5:30. But of course, Vernon never showed up, and when Robert called his residence at 5:45, there was no answer. So Vernon and Charles had probably already left together in the Fairlane, and the unidentified mystery man may have been with them. We also have the account from Sue Nichols, who said she phoned the Shipman residence and spoke to Charles at 5:30. Sue said that Charles sounded drunk, and she then heard someone repeatedly telling him to get off the phone before Charles yelled, quote, "No, Vernon, God no, don't hit me," and the line suddenly went dead. So this gives off the impression that someone else may have been at the residence at this point, and Vernon and Charles were under duress, which is a reasonable assumption, given that Vernon should have already left by this point to pick up Robert. Sue seemed to believe that the voice telling Charles to get off the phone was Vernon's, and the wording of the whole exchange makes it sound like Charles is begging Vernon not to hit him. But it's also possible that Charles was speaking to two separate people, as his first sentence may have been directed at Vernon, and the second sentence was directed at another individual who was physically attacking him. I know that the eyewitness sightings of Vernon and Charles in the Fairlane with the mystery man took place between 5:45 and 6:30 p.m., so when you look at the timeline, they likely would have needed to leave almost immediately after Sue's call. But since all these witnesses reported seeing Louise inside the car along with them, how, when, and why did she become involved? I should add the disclaimer that we technically only have Sue Nichols' word that her final phone call with Charles transpired like this, and while I ordinarily have no reason to think that she would lie, the weird complication is that we have at least one person who seems certain that Sue's half-brother, Frank Myers, was involved in the murders. As you recall, one of the witnesses who saw the three victims in the Fairlane with the unidentified man was Calvert Hunt Jr., who worked at the Tempo Music Shop. Now, the other witnesses described the mystery man as being between 40 to 50 years old, whereas Frank Myers was 25 at that time. Under normal circumstances, I might put more stock into Calvert's sighting since he knew Frank personally. Hell, Calvert was still alive when the Haunting Evidence episode was filmed over 40 years later, and he agreed to return to the location on Little River Road where he saw the Fairlane and be placed under hypnosis to see if he could recollect anything from that night. and after going through all this, Calvert still seemed convinced that Frank was the man he saw in the car. But Ronnie Holifield, one of the other witnesses who saw the man, said that he was absolutely certain it was not Frank. Indeed, it seems like investigators were inclined to believe that Frank was not responsible, as his mother claimed he was at a family gathering over 100 miles away on the night of the murder. However, Calvert believed that Frank's family would have been willing to lie for him and provide him with a fake alibi if need be. So, theoretically, since Sue Nichols was Frank's half-sister, could she have fabricated her story about this phone call in order to protect Frank? Well, I think that's a major stretch, and I do believe that Calvert is probably mistaken about having seen Frank, and it could have just been a major case of confirmation bias. The only potential motive which has been pushed forward for Frank is that he owed Vernon around $1,000 at the time of his death, but it seems pretty extreme that he could go so far as to commit a triple homicide in order to avoid paying it. Not to mention that this was a particularly brutal homicide which involved bludgeoning the 3 victims to death and sexually assaulting Louise, a woman Frank may not have even known, with the shaft of a bumperjack. This seems like a crime where the perpetrator either had an intense hatred for one or more of the victims, or was a sadist who got off on extreme violence. So I have no reason to believe that Sue was not telling the truth about what she heard on the phone that evening, but what exactly happened at the Shipman residence? I really do believe that Vernon and Charles were forced to leave against their will because the front door was open when Harley Shipman returned home several hours later. Harley also found it unusual that Vernon's coat and tie were lying on his bed, which suggests that Vernon may have been in the midst of getting ready to go out to dinner before he was interrupted. Based on the eyewitness accounts, it's easy to assume that the mystery man was holding a gun on the victims from the back seat, but since none of the victims were shot, we can't even be certain if the killer had a gun to begin with. But how exactly did Louise get mixed up in this? Well, we know her abandoned Fairlane was found about 14 miles from the murder scene in a remote area near the French Broad River, so the most prominent theory is that Louise may have driven there in order to pick blackberries or something. But by pure chance, the mystery man's original plan was to take Vernon and Charles out to the same area in order to murder them, and when they arrived and he saw Louise, he abducted her as well and forced Vernon to drive to Lake Summit in order to murder all 3 of them. The killer then drove Vernon's Fairlane to the spot where it was abandoned 6 miles away. We know that the last confirmed sighting of Vernon, Charles, and Louise in the Fairlane together took place at 6:30 p.m. And Dennis Waters, the young man who claimed that he found the abandoned Fairlane and took it for a joyride with his friends, said that they first came across the vehicle at around 8:15. So, given the timeline, the murders likely took place within that 1 hour and 45-minute window. It's unclear if the perpetrator had any transportation of his own, but the Fairlane was found only 3 blocks from Vernon's home. Theoretically, if the killer drove to the Shipman residence, he could have parked his vehicle nearby, and after abandoning the Fairlane, he then walks the 3 blocks or so back to his own vehicle and uses it to flee the area. However, during the early stages of the investigation, the Henderson County Sheriff at that time, Paul Hill, shared his own theory about how Louise became involved. Sheriff Hill believed that Louise and the mystery man originally met at the spot near the French Broad River, and she proceeded to leave her Fairlane there while they drove to the Shipman residence in his vehicle. They then met up with Vernon and Charles and forced them to drive Vernon's Fairlane to Lake Summit, but for reasons unknown, the mystery man decided to double-cross Louise and kill her alongside the 2 men. Sheriff Hill suspected that the whole thing may have been drug-related, since there were rumors that Louise, Vernon, and Charles were involved in the drug trade together. But of course, those rumors were never substantiated, and I have some issues with Hill's theory. The biggest problem is that Louise's abandoned Fairlane was found unlocked, with the windows rolled down and the keys in the ignition, and her handbag was hanging from the door handle with her change purse missing. If Louise left with another man voluntarily, why would she leave her vehicle like that? The evidence really does suggest that she was taken from that spot against her will. However, the theory about Louise being abducted because she was an innocent witness who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time is not perfect either. If the mystery man took Vernon and Charles to that spot to murder them and stumbled across Louise, why not just kill all of them right there at the scene? This was still a pretty remote spot, so what purpose does it serve to abduct Louise and force Vernon to drive them all to another location 14 miles away? It just seems like an unnecessary risk, particularly since multiple witnesses wound up seeing all four of them together in the same car. But then again, given how brutal this crime turned out to be, perhaps trying to apply logic to the actions of a highly illogical person might be an exercise in futility. However, I think the biggest potential issue with this particular theory is that the timeline is very tight. The spot where Louise's car was found near the French Broad River is about 6 miles from Vernon's residence and would take approximately 12 minutes to drive there, but the first eyewitness sighting of the Fairlane took place at 5:45 p.m. Unlike Ronnie Holifield and Calvert Hunt Jr., I do not get the impression that this witness knew Vernon or Charles personally, but she specifically reported seeing 3 men and a woman in the vehicle at that time. Sue Nichols said that her phone call with Charles ended at 5:30, so could the Fairlane have really traveled to that spot and picked up Louise within 15 minutes? The witness did report seeing the vehicle traveling north on Highway 191, which is in the same general area, so it's possible that she did actually see them, but was a little off about the time. On the other hand, the next sighting from Ronnie Holifield took place at 6 p.m. on Evans Road, which is several miles in the opposite direction. If they kept traveling southeast, they would have wound up on Little River Road, which is where Calvert Hunt saw them, and if they continued heading south from there, they would have wound up at the spot at Lake Summit where the bodies were found. So the timeline does fit with the last 2 eyewitness sightings, but if the mystery man had originally been intending to kill Vernon and Charles at the spot near the French Broad River, why would they feel the need to travel 14 miles south in order to commit the murders? Were there no other isolated locations which were closer? I know there was a lot of speculation that Louise may have been acquainted with Vernon and Charles prior to the murders, but I find it surprising that investigators can never conclusively prove this. As an example, we have that one witness who was certain that he saw Louise drinking wine in the Temple Music Shop with Charles's 2 aunts, and that Charles introduced her as his quote-unquote foster aunt, Louise from Asheville. But if Charles's 2 aunts were there, shouldn't they have been able to confirm if this so-called foster aunt was actually Louise Davis Shumate? It seems like we have a lot of rumors and hearsay about Louise having a prior relationship with the 2 men, but it would not surprise me at all if they never met until they were murdered together. It's also worth noting that even though most investigators believe that the 3 victims were killed at the same location their bodies were found, there were always rumors throughout the area that they may have been murdered at the Sheaves Cottages on Greenville Highway, which was a known partying spot in the area during that time period. Over the years, multiple people would make statements about how they had supposedly been paid to transport the victims' bodies from there to the isolated spot near Lake Summit, but these claims were never substantiated. And while some forensic tests were performed at the Sheaves Cottages, no evidence was ever found to indicate that a homicide took place there. Indeed, unless multiple people were involved in this crime, the timeline just seems too tight for the trio to have been killed at another location. So now we have to talk about potential suspects. Here are a few suspects I haven't mentioned yet, though the case against them isn't particularly strong. One of them was a criminal named John Shadrick, who was paroled from the Central Prison in Raleigh in June of 1966 after serving time for forgery of banknotes. It was established that Shadrick was in Henderson County on the day before the murders, as he spent the night at the Hendersonville Inn. A few weeks later, Shadrick and another guy tried to sexually assault a young man at knife point, and Shadrick supposedly said to him, quote, "I've killed 3 people, I just as soon kill you too." In fact, the young man even claimed that Shadrick named his victims and said he had killed them at Lake Summit, and he could hear Shadrick's accomplice mutter the words, "bumperjacks." When Shadrick was questioned by police, he denied any involvement in the murders, stating that he and a friend had spent the afternoon of July the 17th getting high on drugs. No evidence could be found to link Shadrick to the crime, and he died in 1976. A Hendersonville resident who popped up on the radar as a potential suspect was Jim Burrows, a former obituary writer for the Asheville Citizen-Times, who got fired from his job the week before the murders for continually showing up to work smelling of alcohol. It's been reported that Burroughs was a friend of both Vernon and Charles, who also happened to be gay, and at one point, he allegedly confessed to someone that he committed the crime. The main reason Burroughs garnered suspicion was because of an odd phone call he made to a reporter from the Citizen-Times sometimes between July the 18th and the 22nd. At this point, the victims' bodies had not yet been discovered, but according to the reporter, Burroughs told him that there were, quote-unquote, 3 prominent people missing. However, only Vernon and Charles had been reported missing, and nobody knew anything about Louise until her body was found alongside theirs. So why did Burroughs say that 3 people were missing? In spite of this odd anomaly, no evidence was found to indicate that Burroughs was involved in the crime. So I've already expressed my doubts that Frank Myers committed these murders, but let's take a moment to talk about Paul Saxman, the former next-door neighbor of the Shipman family. As you might recall, Paul was living in Indianapolis at that time and renting out his house in Hendersonville, but he accused Charles of pocketing the rent money which was supposed to be paid to the bank, causing the house to go into foreclosure. I'm not sure if the allegations against Charles were actually true, but this could have given Paul a potential motive for murder. All that being said, even though Paul disliked Charles, he had always been good friends with Vernon, so would he really go so far as to kill both of them over this? And once again, I do not believe there was any known connection between Paul and Louise, so how did she get mixed up in the whole situation? One of the main reasons Paul came under suspicion is because he was unable to account for his whereabouts on the date of the murder, and a frog gigging pole with blood on it was found inside Paul's residence in Hendersonville. There was speculation that this could have been used to make the odd puncture marks found on Charles and Louise's bodies, and if this gigging pole was still around today for DNA testing, we might have been able to determine if it had any relevance to the case. Paul had also initially agreed to take a polygraph test and then had his lawyer inform the police he had changed his mind, but given how unreliable polygraph tests are, I wouldn't blame him for making this decision, even if he was completely innocent. However, it's also worth noting that when Paul's house was sold during the foreclosure proceedings, he was entitled to receive $700 from the sale, but he never returned to Hendersonville in order to collect it. When Jenny Jones Giles published her aforementioned series of articles in the Hendersonville Times-News in 2006, Paul was still alive at that point and agreed to be interviewed, but he was living in a nursing home in Indianapolis and could no longer take care of himself. As you can imagine, he was not particularly lucid and had no recollection of his whereabouts during the time of the murder, and he died only a few months after he was interviewed. Like most of the other suspects, there really isn't anything concrete to link Paul to the crime, and my biggest issue is the fact that he had no other known history of violence and criminal activity. To recap, this was a crime in which all 3 victims were bludgeoned to death, 2 of them had several puncture wounds with a sharp object, and a woman was sexually assaulted with the shaft of a bumperjack. Could someone commit a crime this brutal and senseless, and then just go on living the rest of their lives normally without doing anything else like this? It is hard to imagine someone becoming that enraged over missed mortgage payments. Of course, Edward Thompson went on to commit other crimes like this just 2 years later, so I can understand why he might seem like a compelling suspect, but once again, the discrepancy about Thompson being black and the mystery man seen with the victims being white is very difficult to ignore. Now, I mentioned earlier that Terrence Ryerson Neal believes that Thompson was a convenient scapegoat, and he also thinks that Joe Henry Parham should not have been dismissed as a suspect so easily. Parham popped up on the radar in March of 1968 when he confessed to the crime while incarcerated in Florida, and he allegedly shared details which were not public knowledge, but the charge was dropped 2 months later due to lack of evidence. What makes this whole situation particularly bizarre is that it sounds like Parham only specifically confessed to killing Charles and was therefore only charged with that one crime, which indicates that they had no other corroborating evidence to charge him with the murders of Vernon and Louise, even though all 3 victims appeared to have been killed at the same time. So if Parham was being truthful, could this have been a half confession of sorts, where he took part in the murders, but there were multiple people involved? Perhaps Parham did personally kill Charles, but did not confess to murdering Vernon and Louise because they were killed by one or more accomplices. I guess that's not impossible, but investigators always seemed inclined to believe that only one perpetrator was responsible for this crime. All that being said, at around 5:45 a.m. on the morning of Monday, July the 18th, 1966, the day after the three victims went missing, a motorist traveling down North Lake Summit Road reported seeing three vehicles parked near the dirt trail which led to the location of the murder scene. He described the cars as being a blue Pontiac, a 1955 or 1956 cream-colored Chevrolet, and a 1961 or 1962 black Ford, and said there were three men inside the Ford and a fourth man walking outside. There were other witnesses who reported seeing a light blue 1963 Pontiac parked at that same spot the previous night at around 9 p.m. I don't know if these men or vehicles were ever identified, but this was known as a place where people would pull over and hang out to drink. On the other hand, it is odd that they were seen in this remote area, so close to where the bodies were later found. What made Parham's arrest so messy is that even though Henderson County Sheriff James Kilpatrick initially thought he was the right guy, Buncombe County Sheriff Harry Clay decided to undermine his case by publicly expressing his belief that Parham didn't do it. I mentioned earlier that even though the crime technically took place in Henderson County, Sheriff Clay decided to take charge of the original investigation, and you get the impression that he wanted to solve the case himself and get all the glory. So Clay's decision to undermine Parham's arrest may have been a power play on his part, as he did not like the idea of Kilpatrick getting the credit. When Parham was rearrested for another crime in Buncombe County the following year, Clay told the press that Parham admitted his confession was a hoax, but I haven't seen this information corroborated by any other source, and we technically only have Clay's word on that. It's also possible that Kilpatrick may have been overzealous when he charged Parham. Kilpatrick was not Henderson County Sheriff when the crime originally took place, as he defeated incumbent Sheriff Paul Hill during the next election, which was held in November of 1966. This was considered to be a major upset at the time, but it was believed that Hill's inability to solve the triple homicide was the main factor in him losing, so I can see why Kilpatrick would not want the case to remain unsolved on his watch. I mean, it's possible that Clay was right all along, and Parham was the wrong guy, but this whole situation gives off the impression that politics may have muddied the investigation. As for Parham, it looks like he still continued to have problems with the law after the murder charge was dropped. On June the 13th, 1970, Parham was arrested in Florida after shooting his common-law wife, June Mills, in the head during an argument at their home. She wound up surviving, and Parham claimed that he only meant to fire the shot over Mills's head and did not intend to harm her. As a result, he only wound up receiving a 5-year prison sentence on the charge of aggravated assault. The last information I could find on Parham were some news articles from June of 1982 about an incident where he read a red light in Fort Myers while driving under the influence and wound up causing an accident which injured 8 people. But after that, he seemed to fade from the spotlight, and I have no idea when or if Parham passed away. Even though Parham was originally born in South Carolina, it looks like he had been living in Florida for years prior to being charged with murder, so I'm not sure if he could be placed in Henderson County in July of 1966. Since Parham was a migrant worker with a third-grade education, a triple homicide like this does seem a bit sophisticated for him, and it's hard to imagine him pulling it off without leaving more damning evidence behind. Not to mention that Parham did not seem to have any known connection to the 3 victims, so I'm not sure what his motive could have been. But I find it to be interesting timing that Edward Thompson's crime spree began around the same time when the murder charge against Parham was dismissed. So if Parham was involved and the authorities let him slip through their fingers, Thompson definitely would have seemed like a convenient scapegoat. But the problem is that there is just no definitive evidence pointing to Thompson, Parham, or any of the other suspects. In order to pinpoint who did this, we also have to figure out what the motive could have been and what led to these 3 particular victims being murdered at the same time. Well, it seems obvious that the unidentified mystery man seen by all these witnesses was responsible. How did Vernon, Charles, and Louise all wind up in that car together with him at the same time? No matter how you look at this crime, it's really difficult to formulate a theory which makes 100% complete sense, and it seems like we're missing one or more pieces of this puzzle which could tie everything together. Part of me does wonder if this might have been some sort of thrill kill committed by an impulsive criminal like Edward Thompson, who selected his victims completely at random, and there was no rhyme and reason to his actions. Since nearly 60 years have passed, and most of the people connected to this case are now deceased, we may never learn the full truth about what happened, and it's a major shame that all the physical evidence has been lost, since DNA testing and genetic genealogy could have paved the way to a resolution after all this time. In the eyes of some people, this case has unofficially been solved, as they are certain that Edward Thompson did this, but I wouldn't say I'm entirely convinced. And even if it was Thompson, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how or why he did this. I know this is a very old cold case, but if by chance you happen to have any information about the murders of Vernon Shipman, Charles Glass, and Louise Davis Shumate, please contact the Henderson County Sheriff's Office at 825-697-4596. That's 825-697-4596. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about a wanted fugitive named Carl Alfred Eder, who was convicted of the murders of a mother and her 4 children when he was only 16 years old, but wound up escaping from prison in 1974 and has not been seen since. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode for my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my 2 co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover another memorable case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1988 disappearance of Elizabeth Campbell. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Jaguar9400, Amanda P., Deborah M., Chelsea S., M. Little, and Cecilia Michelle B. Thank you all so much for your support. I wanted to remind everyone that later this year, The Trail Went Cold has been booked to appear on Podcast Row at 2 separate CrimeCon events. The American CrimeCon, which is taking place at the Gaylord Opryland Hotel in Nashville from May the 31st until June the 2nd, and CrimeCon UK, which is taking place at 133 Houndsditch in London on September the 21st and 22nd. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code to get a 10% discount at both events, so please visit crimecon.com or crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COLE24. Once again, that's crimecon.com or crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COLE24. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.